Hi, I'm John Nash, and welcome to Café UCEA. There is a relatively widespread agreement that school leaders play a pivotal role in creating and sustaining high-performing schools, and because of this, evaluating their effectiveness is an increasing topic of conversation in state and federal policy circles. Although principals have always been subject to some form of personnel evaluation, changes at the state and federal levels have led to the creation of a slew of new principal evaluation systems across the country. Much of the impetus for these changes is from federal grants, for instance, Race to the Top, Effective Teachers and Leaders, No Child Left Behind. But the question is, how is federal policy driving new moves that states are making to hold principals accountable for student performance? And how does this relate to leader preparation programs? We're going to spend the next 20 to 30 minutes trying to unpack some of this, and you can participate by be live in our program by watching this on Google+. At the bottom right of the video window, click Ask a New Question, then type your question and click Submit. We'll do the best to answer it during the show. My guests today are Sheneka Williams, Associate Professor and Coordinator of the Program of Educational Administration and Policy at the University of Georgia, and Ed Fuller, Associate Professor in the Educational Leadership Program within the Ed Policy Studies Department at Penn State University. They're the co-editors of the December 2015 special issue of the Journal of Research on Leadership Education, which focused on the policy context of Race to the Top and the future of principal preparation programs. Sheneka, welcome to Café UCEA.
Thank you, John. Thank you for having us.
And Ed, thanks for being on Café UCEA.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
So, Sheneka, I'd like to start with you. You note in the special issue that there's a new era of accountability that's ushered in an increased federal role in public education that stretches from all the way to the principal's office and maybe even farther into the way principals are prepared. Can you talk to us a little bit about this new era you see?
Well, I refer to it, John, as a new era simply because, the Fed is beginning to push a few more dollars toward states and schools and districts, and with those dollars comes a level of responsibility for states and districts. So, for instance, with Race to the Top funding, school districts were encouraged, if you will, to reconsider how they evaluate principals. And so with that, because states were struggling and districts were struggling, they wanted the funds, but in order to get the funds, they had to rethink and restructure some things. And I do think that this is going to be a new way of doing business coming out of the, with the federal role in education. So given that, I think it's very important for school districts, principals in particular, to understand this larger context in which they operate. Oftentimes school principals tend to think locally, and that's not a bad thing because they have schools to run. But I also want to encourage in this conversation the larger framing or the larger context in which they're operating, and a lot of it is driven by federal dollars.
What do you think the most important things local principals need to take away from this movement right now?
I think they need to think about, the principal, only second to the teacher, is the largest influencer of student achievement, right? We have research that tells us that. But I think that principals need to think about how they can better create a culture to get the student achievement gains we're looking for. And I think we think about the dollars, of course, because the districts and states need the dollars, but I also think if principals think about what they can do at their schools, whether or not they have the dollars, there are changes that they can control within their own context without doing the dance, if you will.
So, Ed, the articles in the special issue allude to increasing governmental regulation regarding leadership evaluation and preparation. Can you unpack a little bit about what's going on there?
Right. Historically, the federal government hasn't played much of a role in education outside of civil rights issues, which are really important, and funding issues, particularly around special education students. But with the Obama administration following up on the Bush administration, they really doubled down on the federal role, and through, like as you mentioned, Race to the Top and No Child Left Behind waivers and a lot of grant programs, they really dangled a lot of money in front of states and districts right during the recession when everybody needed it desperately, as Sheneka pointed out. So they really took advantage of a situation to strongly influence what states were doing, and states largely control the evaluation systems for all educators. With ESSA, which was recently passed and signed into law, which came after our special issue was written. It's a little unclear how that's going to play out, but I suspect these systems are in place already and they're just starting to run, so there may be some pullback, but what the federal government incentivized to occur is not going to go away very rapidly. I think even if the next administration doesn't really put a lot of emphasis on this, it's still going to continue to play through state systems of principal evaluation, and teacher evaluation, and teacher and principal preparation program evaluation. I think those are all going to continue pretty much down the path that they've started. There might be more opportunity to influence the particulars of those programs.
So both of you, can you talk to us a little bit about what the pros and the cons are of the way the policy waters are running? Ostensibly, this policy work is coming down the pike because there are well-intentioned individuals that think that this is going to bring some new quality to bear on the environment. On the other hand, there are some concerns that this sort of direction is not the way we ought to be heading. Talk to me a little bit about what's good about this, what's bad about this, what should we be thinking about as we try to make sense of this?
You know, I think one thing that's good, and I would agree with what Ed has said, in some ways, the federal government hasn't been involved as much in education other than on issues of civil rights, and some would argue that they've been a little lax on that as of late. So I think in one regard, the federal government having some involvement isn't a terribly bad thing, because I don't know that we can trust all states to do the right thing, right? Given the historic nature of what's happening or what has happened in some states. But also, I think when it becomes a competition, I don't know that then the access is there for all. So I think that is when it also becomes a bad thing. So for instance, the race to the top dollars, while that's a strong encouragement, there's a competition for that, right? So I wonder if there are ways to make the access to the dollars more equitable so that all states and all districts have an equal chance at it. So I don't know that it's an overall bad thing, but I can't say it's a great thing either because of the way the dollars are doled out. But I'll defer to Ed on some of his thinking.
So I completely understand the impetus of both state and federal policymakers in their efforts to improve teacher and principal effectiveness. I work for the state in Texas. I helped write some bills that put out report cards about teacher and principal preparation programs. And I know they are the individuals are well-intentioned because they want I think most of them at least anyway, want every student to have access to a really effective teacher and principal. The drawback of the policies around principal effectiveness or evaluation tools is that there really wasn't any research at all on how to evaluate principals when Race to the Top and the other federal policies were put into place. And it would appear to me that they were targeting teachers originally, and then as an afterthought, they thought, hey, we forgot principals. Let's put principals in the competitions as well, without thinking through or asking experts like, can you evaluate principals? How can you evaluate principals? Is there a fair way to evaluate principals? the research was a lot more, although it wasn't a large body of research, there was some actual research about evaluating teachers, and people had been playing around with different strategies to do that. But there just wasn't any research at all about evaluating principals outside of the, the general review of, hey, principals get observed and they do a self-evaluation, and that's how they typically get evaluated. Which I think most people would agree, yeah, that wasn't sufficient in evaluating principals, but making a leap from, hey, the current system's insufficient to let's just do something everywhere across the whole country was way too big of a leap. We needed to find out what works and what doesn't, and we're starting to do that, but we're a long way off from really knowing how these efforts play out and what's the best strategy to create a fair and equitable and system that really improves outcomes. We just don't know yet how to do that.
So if I might, John, I'd like to pick up on what Ed has said. So I think one of the general takeaways here is that we have decisions being made without research to tell us whether or not the decisions should be made, right?
Absolutely.
So then we're too far down the road in some ways to back it up. And so if we go back to the earlier question of what are some of the drawbacks, some of the drawbacks are we're kind of taking risks with students in mind, right? With schools in mind. We're taking huge risks because we don't yet have the research base to help inform some of the decisions that are being made.
Let's maybe, so what I'm hearing a little bit is that the bright lines sort of between student performance and the way principals are acting in those schools and the effectiveness is, that's sort of a dangerous line to take. I mean, is it that there hasn't been much thought to the various contexts in which principals work and which and also leader prep programs operate? Is that what's missing? What's missing here, if you could advise on how best to take this to a better level?
I think policymakers assumed, and generally rightfully so, that principals do impact student outcomes, all different types of student outcomes. What they failed to investigate was whether we could measure that impact accurately, and it turns out that we're not really sure we can measure it accurately. I have a paper on this. There's a couple of other papers on this. There's a new paper out looking at Pennsylvania that claims that they can more accurately assess principal effectiveness, but it hasn't been published and peer-reviewed yet. I haven't read it. It's by Mathematica, and I mean, they're really high-quality researchers. But it's really complicated, and part of that is because we can't, in the statistical models that everybody's using or should be using to try to do this, we can't pick up the effect of all the different things going on in the community in which the school is located. Like, we can't control for all those factors that influence student outcomes. We can kind of put in, although frankly my research showed that a lot of states don't even consider student background characteristics when they try to identify principal effectiveness. But even when you do those things that are typically include those data points that are typically available and data that states make available, you're still not capturing all the things that influence student outcomes. And when you leave those out, the only way leaving those out is I mean, it's never completely acceptable, but part of the issue with leaving those out is they're not equitably distributed or equally distributed across schools. So you end up with a system that's biased against leaders in certain types of schools and in certain types of communities. And that was a huge danger that I just don't think policymakers thought through very well. Particularly at the federal level, they did not provide guidance to states about how to do this. And states just oftentimes picked what the easiest system or the cheapest system or something that they could understand or somebody in the state knew how to do already, and they didn't investigate, well, what's the outcomes of our decisions on what tool to use on students and principals and who wins and who loses.
This is Café UCEA, and my guests are Ed Fuller of Penn State and Sheneka Williams of the University of Georgia. You can participate in our live program if you are watching this via Google+. At the bottom right of the video window, click Ask a New Question, and then type your question and click Submit, and we'll answer it during the show. Sheneka, did you want to add something to that?
No, I think Ed, did a great job characterizing what might have happened in some of these states with these evaluation systems. I do think, though, some of the pressures, I will just add, rather, some of the pressures that we've seen with teachers and teacher evaluation is now going down the pike to principals. And I think the link in terms of research is harder to make, and that is a dangerous place to be at this time.
Yeah, you talk in the special issue a little bit about the blame game. I think you use a term like that. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, in some ways, yes, the blame game. But I do think the blame game for principals, we don't have the research. We don't know how to accurately measure the effectiveness yet. So with that, there's a danger, and I keep using the term danger because I think once the Fed goes down a path, it's very hard to back up from that. So I think the ball is kind of down the road at this point, and I don't know how we can back it up.
I've got a question here from Matt Militello, who's noting that federalism is still strong, especially in this election year. And that said, what would even more local control look like? Local being the district level. What can or should districts do to create measures for effective principles, and what metrics?
That's a good question. We don't really know yet, so we should be having pilot studies around the country to try to do this. But I think one of the scary things I see is that I think we're about to start including non-cognitive outcomes in evaluations of principles, in the belief that that will be a more a fairer and more accurate way to measure principal effectiveness.
Say a little bit about what
it turns out that those are correlated with student characteristics as well, just like value-added measures and any kind of student growth measure, at least the way states do those. What I would suggest, and I'm working with our local school district here, is we do surveys of students and teachers and principals and parents and lots of information, and the central office staff go and talk with the principals and look what's going on in the school. You can collect lots of information. The important thing about doing it with local control is that the local people understand the context a lot better than the state. So for example, in our local high school, we're building a new high school on the same plot of land while the kids are in the school. So that's a lot of turmoil. And so they had to go to they chose to go to block scheduling because they didn't want the kids outside. They have 2 buildings and you have to cross the street. There's lots of construction. They didn't want the kids out in the construction. They wanted them out there as little as possible. So they went to block scheduling. Teachers weren't very happy. Students weren't very happy. Parents weren't very happy. So their survey scores went down. If a state was looking at that principle would be targeted as, hey, you're lower performing, you've got a downward trajectory, but it was easily explainable by the fact that, what was going on with the building. It wasn't associated with what the principal was doing. And so that's the benefit of local control over state control. I think the state should be in the business of collecting data and transferring it to the local districts, and the local districts then collect additional data and make decisions there. The one drawback of doing that is ultimately you're relying on the knowledge and skills and dispositions and whatever else you want to throw in there of the superintendent. So you're relying a lot on the superintendent and in some respects the school board to make good decisions and be fair and equitable with the principals, and we know that's not always the case. So there's no way you can win on everything there. So
Sheneka, do you have thoughts on what districts could or should do to create measures for effective?
Well, it kind of goes back to the way Ed answered, and I don't know if this is an answer to the original question. But what I'm hearing is that, Ed, do you think we should be going to more like 360 evaluations of principals?
360 is a great way. I mean, it's something that everybody should probably be doing, but it's not sufficient in and of itself to capture everything that principals do. But I think it's a good approach.
Do you think that when we start thinking locally, this might bleed into the ways in which district leaders are evaluated, particularly superintendents?
That's I'm watching out for this because I think it's going to have to come sooner or later. And that gets even trickier to evaluate a superintendent because they're even further removed from outcomes. And at the district level, they're even more subject to the whims of the state, particularly around equitable funding. Like Pennsylvania has the most inequitable school finance system in the country. If you're sitting in and we haven't even passed a budget yet, so we're almost a year without a budget. So if you don't have any money at your school and your district, what are you supposed to do as a superintendent? I mean, it gets really tricky, and it goes back to the beginning of this conversation, when we both said that state and particularly federal policymakers didn't think through all these issues. It's really complicated. They just threw it in there real quick, like, oh, it'll work out, it'll be fine. But we don't know if that's the case yet.
We have a bit of feedback from Matt Militello noting, I also think we need to measure principal reach and outcomes with student and community members, including perceptions. We need to honor wisdom of community members and the students, both often overlooked when we measure principal effectiveness.
I would concur with that. One of the things I told our local superintendent and superintendents around here is you have to work really, really hard to get enough input from everybody in your community so that you have generalizable and accurate results. Because typically who answers those kind of requests, either people really that love the district or love the principal or hate the principal or hate the district, but you often get more affluent, more connected individuals answering those, and people who are typically marginalized and disenfranchised don't participate then. So you get a one-sided view of what's going on, and that's my fear there. It can be overcome, but it takes a lot of work on the effort of district and school leaders.
Yeah.
And I would just also like to add, it takes a lot of work, and I don't want us to get caught up in the work of evaluation and forgetting what we're hoping to do with the results, right? I think it's very, very important, but we always have to loop back to what do the results tell us, and what are we going to do with the results? We can't do it just for the sake of it and whether or not there's a pay raise as the result. We need to figure out, what does this mean for teaching and learning for students in schools. And I think oftentimes that piece gets lost in this larger discussion.
Really good. Go ahead, Ed.
I was going to completely agree with that, because that part's so hard to measure for the principal that we end up measuring everything else because we can.
Yeah.
And we miss the core of what we really want to be talking about. So you were spot on there.
So as usual, there's more questions than answers, but I think this also goes to part of what you both noted in the special issue was and I'm quoting here, a paucity of research that supports the policies adopted by states. I've talked with you earlier as we got ready for the show, to both of you, about where the needs are. Talk to us a little bit about where the opportunities for research are now. What are the questions that our fellow scholars should be pursuing? What should we be thinking about to get at this?
I can start with that. One is, and we're doing this in Pennsylvania, is to gather the perceptions of principals about how these systems play out, as well as superintendents and even teachers, because teachers are subject to the principal evaluations as well. They've got their own system, but the principal matters to them a lot. And are they we need a lot more, particularly quantitative research on whether we can accurately measure principal effectiveness, and can we create a system that is accurate and is fair to everybody? Can we capture the differences in context across schools and create a fair system? That's really unclear. And then are there, with the non-cognitive outcomes, which I think are really, really important, can we do that in any way? I mean, and how can we do that? And Matt kind of brought that up. You know, that's a great question. Can we do this? Perceptions of community members and teachers and whatever. But how do you do that well and in a fair manner? We just don't know yet. So there's pretty much any research you would do on this issue would be beneficial at this point because there's so little research on it.
Yeah. Sheneka?
You know, I would add that some implementation studies need to be done. Like, thinking about sense making, I think we're not certain how principals are making sense of some of the policies and things they're asked to implement in their schools. I would even back that up to the district level. And until we understand how they're making sense of some of the policies and some of the things that they're implementing, we can't get at how they are, whether or not they're effective, because we don't know how they understand it, right? So I think there's space here for some policy practice studies, particularly on the implementation end, because so much of policy implementation happens at the school level, but I would argue that there's a disconnect. And that takes us back to this whole special issue and this conversation on this larger policy context. I think there's some conversations that need to be had, getting at perceptions and how are principals understanding, and then being able to, you know, further delve into the effectiveness of one.
Well, thank you both very much for a very interesting conversation and enlightening us on some of the intricacies of what's happening with regard to federal policy and principal evaluation. Ed, thank you very much. Sheneka, thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
That's our show for today. Café UCEA is produced by the University Council for Educational Administration. Marcy Reedy at the University of Virginia co-produced the show. An archive of this program and the show notes can be found on the UCEA Google Plus page. I'm John Nash at the University of Kentucky. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.